was a cold, moonless night, and I was driving down a deserted highway that seemed to stretch on forever. I was coming back from a long trip to visit my family, trying to make it home before exhaustion took over. I was passing through a rural area, with dark fields on both sides and no sign of civilization for miles. The steady hum of the engine and the intermittent glow of my headlights were my only companions. That's when I saw her, a figure standing by the roadside frantically waving. She was a young woman wearing a white dress that seemed stained with dirt and torn in places. Her face was partially obscured by disheveled hair, and she looked disoriented. I hesitated. The place was too isolated and something about her felt off, but my sense of humanity won out. I slowed down and pulled over beside her. Rolling down the window, I asked if she needed help. She replied in a faint, almost inaudible voice that she needed a ride to the next town. I agreed, though an inexplicable unease crept over me. She climbed into the back seat. The smell of damp earth immediately filled the car, and I noticed her bare feet were caked in mud. "Do you live around here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She mumbled something I couldn't understand, her voice low and distant. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I realized she wasn't just looking at me. She was watching me with an almost supernatural intensity. Her eyes seemed empty, like bottomless pits. A chill ran down my spine, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I kept driving, but something felt wrong. The road seemed longer than it should have been. I glanced at the GPS, but it failed to show my location. The silence between us was almost unbearable. I tried asking again where exactly she wanted to be dropped off, but when I turned my head to look at the back seat, she was gone. The seat was empty, but muddy footprints were left on the upholstery. My hair stood on end. I began looking around, thinking she must have left without me noticing. Then I saw something in the rearview mirror. Her face. Pale and cold, it was right behind me, though the seat remained empty. "You left me behind before," she whispered, her voice echoing like a muffled scream. "This time I won't leave." Before I could react, I felt an icy hand on the back of my neck. The headlights went out, and the last thing I remember was the sound of my own scream as the car seemed to be swallowed by darkness. To this day, I still wonder who that woman was, where she came from, and why she said I left her behind. This story haunts me to this very day. I was driving home late at night, and the road felt longer than usual. As the miles passed, an inexplicable exhaustion began to creep in, as if something was draining my energy. The scenery around me never changed, the same tall trees and unsettling shadows that seemed to watch me. After driving for over an hour, I realized I was passing the same set of signs and curves again. It was as if I was stuck in a loop. I started to suspect something was seriously wrong. I decided to turn on the radio to fend off the creeping loneliness, but all I heard was disturbing static. I tried switching stations, but nothing worked. Despair began to take hold when I realized there was no escape from this endless road. As I kept driving, I saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like a cabin, a refuge in the unending darkness. I parked and ran to the door, pounding on it desperately. An old man opened, his tired eyes reflecting the same terror I felt. "You're trapped too," he said before I could ask anything. Behind him, I saw hundreds of maps scattered across a table, all scribbled with routes that led to nothingness. "This road never ends." Before I could respond, the cabin vanished, and I was back in my car. The engine started on its own, and the road began again. I don't know how long I drove in that endless loop, but at some point it just stopped. The road ahead was no longer the same repetitive stretch. It was finally new, with signs and landmarks I hadn't seen before. My heart raced with relief, but I didn't dare stop the car. I just kept driving, afraid that if I slowed down, I'd be dragged back into whatever nightmare that was. Even now, I question whether it was all just a vivid dream brought on by exhaustion or something far more sinister. There's no way to explain what happened. No logic to make sense of it. All I know is that the fear I felt on that night has never left me. Every time I see a lonely stretch of highway, I feel that same chill creeping up my spine, as if the road itself is waiting for me to return. I don't think I'll ever be able to drive at night without the memory of that endless road haunting me. It was late, and I was driving down a winding mountain road, thick fog blanketing everything around me. The kind of fog that swallows light, leaving your headlights barely cutting through a few feet ahead. The air felt heavy, the silence pressing down on me like an invisible weight. It had been hours since I'd seen another car or even a sign of civilization, and the isolation was beginning to gnaw at me. I was on my way back from a work trip, eager to make it home before exhaustion set in. The fog made every turn on the road feel like a gamble, my grip on the wheel tightening with each passing minute. That's when I saw him. A man, standing on the shoulder of the road, partially obscured by the mist. He was tall, wearing an old coat and had his thumb out, signaling for a ride. I hesitated. Picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere didn't feel like the smartest idea, but the weather was brutal, and I couldn't just leave him out there. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a lift?" I asked, my voice more uncertain than I intended. The man nodded and got into the car without a word. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes seemed to avoid mine as he stared straight ahead. The silence between us was deafening. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed, but he only muttered, "Just keep driving." His voice was low, gravelly, and something about it sent a chill down my spine. The drive felt endless. The fog seemed thicker now, clinging to the car like a living thing. Every so often I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye. His hands rested on his lap, but they looked off, too large, almost misshapen. And then there was the smell, a faint, acrid scent that I couldn't place but made my stomach churn. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Turn left up ahead." His voice had a commanding tone, and without thinking, I obeyed. The road he directed me to wasn't on my GPS. It was narrow, winding, and surrounded by dense trees. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I kept going, the man's presence weighing on me like a stone. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You've been here before." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaky. "You left me here. Don't you remember?" His gaze finally met mine, and his eyes were black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the dim light of the dashboard. Panic overtook me, and I slammed on the brakes. When I turned to confront him, the passenger seat was empty. The smell lingered, though, and I realized my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I threw the car into reverse, desperate to get back to the main road. The fog seemed to clear as I drove, and soon I found myself back on the highway, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something. I wasn't meant to survive. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was, but every time I see fog rolling in on the road, I feel his eyes on me, waiting for the moment I'll return to him. was nearing midnight and I was driving down an empty stretch of highway, heading back home after a family reunion. The road was eerily quiet, not another car in sight, and the only sound was the hum of my engine. The darkness around me felt heavy and the faint glow of my headlights seemed swallowed by the night. About an hour into the drive, I saw something strange in the distance. A convoy of vehicles traveling in perfect unison. There were no headlights, only the faint outline of the cars against the faint moonlight. Intrigued but cautious, I slowed down to match their pace. The vehicles moved silently, their engines making no sound. There was something unnatural about the way they drove. No deviations, no lane changes, just an unwavering straight line. I decided to overtake them, curiosity eating at me. As I pulled up alongside the first car, I glanced into the driver's seat. My stomach dropped. The driver's face was pale, almost translucent, and completely devoid of expression. Their hands gripped the wheel tightly, but their eyes, they were empty, lifeless. I sped up, overtaking car after car, only to find that every single driver was the same, identical. By the time I passed the last car, my hands were shaking. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting them to vanish, but they remained following me at the same steady pace. The thought of pulling over and letting them pass crossed my mind, but something deep in my gut told me I shouldn't stop. Suddenly, my radio flickered to life, even though I hadn't turned it on. Static filled the car, and beneath it, I thought, I could hear faint whispers. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My heart raced as I reached for the dial to turn it off, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then, I saw them, again. The convoy was ahead of me now, blocking the road entirely, but I hadn't seen them pass me, they were just there. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt, and came to a stop. The cars remained motionless, as if waiting for me to act. The static on the radio grew deafening, and then it stopped. A single voice broke through the silence, clear and emotionless. "You shouldn't be here." Before I could react, the convoy began moving again, driving directly toward me. Panic consumed me, and I threw the car into reverse, speeding backward until my tires skidded off the road. When I looked up again, the convoy was gone. The road was empty, silent as the grave. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I haven't driven that highway since. The thought of those lifeless drivers and their eerie, silent vehicles still haunts me. Even now, when I drive at night, I can't help but check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that convoy creeping up behind me. If you love real horror stories, this channel is for you. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more chilling tales every week. Turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying case.